In this screencast, we're going to take a look at Chapter 12 in our study guide, The Expansion of China. The political disorder following the collapse of the Han Dynasty was reversed by the establishment of centralized government under the Sui Dynasty from 589 to 618. The brief period of Sui rule was followed by the powerful Tang from 618 to 907 and the Song from 960 to 1279. Although the era of the Tang was characterized by trade and agricultural expansion, that of the Song produced significant technological advances. At the same time, the Song emphasized Chinese tradition, including the patriarchal family and Confucian teachings. The Tang Dynasty. Internal disorder preceded the rise of the Tang Dynasty in 618. The Tang conquered the Central Asia to the eastern border of Bactria, which is present-day Afghanistan, including portions of Tibet, Manchuria, and South Vietnam. In order to solidify control of their vast empire, the Tang used diplomacy and also strengthened the Great Wall to ward off the advances of nomadic peoples. The expanding Tang Empire centered on a bureaucracy influenced by the scholar gentry and by Confucian perceptions of effective government. During both the Tang and Song eras, the Chinese civil service examination was strengthened. In spite of the emphasis placed by the Tang government on Confucian principles, Buddhism gained acceptance in China during the Tang period. Buddhism's popularity among both elite and peasant groups resulted in an initial acceptance of the faith by Tang rulers. Thousands of monasteries populated by Buddhist monks and nuns dotted the Chinese landscape under early Tang rule. Especially supportive of Buddhism was Empress Wu, ruled from 690 to 705, who supported Buddhist art and sculpture and attempted to promote the faith as a state religion. As imperial tax exemptions and private gifts of property to Buddhist monasteries increased their wealth, the Tang began to fear the increasing power of Buddhism. Consequently, later Tang rulers placed restrictions on gifts of land and money to Buddhist monasteries, a policy that weakened the influence of the Buddhist faith in China. As Buddhism declined in power and wealth, Confucianism gained in popularity as an expression of Chinese tradition. The decline of the Tang. Following the pattern of earlier Chinese dynasties, the Tang dynasty weakened as internal rebellion spread through the empire. At the same time, the Tang were plagued by invasions of nomadic peoples along their northern borders. By the 9th century, these nomads had placed themselves in control of large portions of northern China. Civil disorder reigned between the fall of the Tang in 907 and the accession of the Song in 960. Achievements of the Tang. Under Tang rule, trade and travel along the Silk Roads was protected. Contacts with Islamic peoples increased. Ocean-going ships were improved, increasing interest in ocean trade. Chinese junks were among the world's best ships, and Chinese merchants dominated trade in the Indian Ocean. Paper money was introduced to China. Letters of credit, or flying money, facilitated long-distance trade. Urban or city areas grew in size. Canals and irrigation systems increased agricultural productivity. The Tang extended the Chinese canal system to supplement the Grand Canal, an 1,100-mile waterway constructed under the Sui to ease trade by connecting northern and southern China. Large estates were broken up and land redistributed. Gunpowder was invented. Short stories and poetry were popular. Tea and fast-growing rice were imported from Vietnam. Population growth in the rice-growing south surpassed that of the millet-growing north. The Song dynasty. This continues on page 118. In 960, China was overtaken by the Song dynasty. From its beginnings, the Song dynasty was unable to completely control the Khitan, a nomadic people of the north of the empire that had already assimilated much of Chinese culture. Throughout its 300-year rule of China, the Song had to pay tribute to the Khitan to keep them from conquering additional Song territory. Under the Song dynasty, many Chinese traditions were strengthened. For example, civil service exams were emphasized as a prerequisite for government posts. Greater prestige was granted to the scholar gentry. Neo-Confucianism arose as a blend of Confucian and Buddhist values. The new philosophy promoted the application of Confucian respect for authority and family to the everyday life of all levels of Chinese society, a feature that made it attractive to Chinese rulers. At the same time, the traditional aspect of Neo-Confucianism heightened the tendency of the Chinese elite classes to withdraw from contact with other peoples. Neo-Confucianism also reinforced gender and class distinctions or differences. The Song emphasis on the importance of the scholar gentry over the military weakened its ability to withstand the threat of the Khitan conquests of its northern borders. The cost of tribute or payments paid to the Khitan burdened the Song economy as a whole, and especially the peasant class. Efforts at reform ended in the late 11th century when Neo-Confucians re-established Chinese tradition. The faltering Song Empire now faced another threat, invasions by the Jurchens, another nomadic group. The Jurchens had overthrown the Khitan and settled in the region north of the Song Empire. They continued their conquest by dominating most of the basin of the Honghe, or Yellow River, and causing the Song to retreat southward. The Song continued to thrive in the basin of the Yangtze River until 1279, during this time achieving noteworthy cultural and technological advances. The achievements of the Song. During the rule of the Song dynasty, overseas trade began under the Tang had continued. Artists expressed themselves through landscape paintings. Warfare saw the use of catapults to hurl bombs and grenades. Armies and ships used flamethrowers and rocket launchers. Printing with movable type was developed. Compasses were used in ocean navigation. The abacus was developed to aid counting and the recording of taxes. The practice of foot binding spread among the elite classes. Later, lower classes would often adopt the custom as well, and the concept of the patriarchal family intensified. The extension of China's influence. The reestablishment of tradition among the Chinese during the Tang and Song dynasties did not prevent Chinese culture from expanding to other regions in the East. Throughout the period, Japan built on its previous contacts with Chinese culture, while Vietnam and Korea forged new ones. So this section continues on page 119 and talks about Japan. During the 7th century CE, Chinese culture reached Japan. Attempts by the Japanese emperor to mimic or copy the form of Chinese bureaucracy resulted in Japan's adoption of both Confucian thought and Chinese written characters. Buddhism mixed with Shinto, the traditional Japanese belief system that revered spirits of nature and of ancestors. Aristocratic rebellion against the complete adoption of Chinese ways led to the restoration of the elite classes and the establishment of large estates in Japan. Local aristocrats began to acquire their own military. as the power of the Japanese emperor steadily gave way to that of aristocrats in the capital of Kyoto, the power of the local lords in the countryside increased. Rather than providing land and labor for the imperial court, local lords ran their own tiny kingdoms. The Japanese countryside saw the construction of fortresses, protected by earthen walks and ditches similar to the moats used by European fortresses in Chapter 13. The small states into which Japan was divided by the 11th century were led by bushi, who not only administered their territories but also maintained their own military. Armed military troops called samurai served the bushi. Periodically, the samurai also were expected to serve in the capital to protect the emperor from bandits. Armed with curved swords, they engaged in battles in which they shouted out the details of their family heritage before engaging in conflicts. The rise of the samurai gradually moved Japan toward a style of feudalism, with some similarities to that of Western Europe during the same period. A samurai code of honor called Bushido developed. This code included the practice of seppuku, or disembowelment, a form of suicide used by defeated or disgraced warriors to maintain family and personal honor. Japanese peasants gradually became serfs, bound to the land and considered property of the local lord. By the 12th century, powerful families such as the Fujiwara allied themselves with local lords. During the late 12th century, a series of conflicts called Genpei Wars placed peasants against the samurai. The Japanese countryside was destroyed. As a result of the Genpei Wars, in 1185, a powerful family, the Minamoto, established the Bakufu, or military government. Although the emperor and his court remained, real power now resided in the Minamoto family and their samurai. As imperial government broke down, the Japanese increasingly distanced themselves from the Chinese Confucian ways. The shogunate. During the 13th and 14th centuries, real Japanese authority lay in the hands of prominent families who, in turn, controlled military leaders called shoguns. A period of civil disorder in the 14th century lessened the power of both the emperor and the shogunate. The resulting power vacuum allowed the bushi vassals to acquire lands that they then divided among their samurai. The samurai were required to pledge loyalty to their lord and provide him with military assistance when needed. Further court rebellions from 1467 to 1477 culminated in the division of Japan into approximately 300 tiny kingdoms, each ruled by a warlord called the daimyo. Japanese warrior culture changed as the code of Bushido lost its dominance in the 15th and 16th centuries. Large castles of stone and wood began to dot the Japanese landscape. Poorly trained peasant armies armed with pikes became a major fighting force of daimyo armies. Gradually, some daimyo began to impose a degree of centralization upon their vassals and peasants. Taxes were collected to fund public projects such as the improvement of irrigation systems. Trade between villages arose and blossomed into long-distance trade, including trade with China. Merchant and artisan guilds arose. Both men and women participated in these organizations. The strengthening of trade in Japan promoted the use of a common currency or money system that assisted the centralization of the Japanese state. Although trade revived in Japan, Japanese art also was developing its characteristic traditions. Although much Japanese art was an imitation of Chinese models, Japanese artists created their own style in sketches done in ink. Both Shintoism and Buddhism were reflected in two additional examples of Japanese artistry, the tea ceremony and decorative gardens.